The weight of steel, the frozen mud around the farmhouse, held fragments of the MG15 like broken promises scattered in the January dawn. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy crouched behind the stone wall, watching his breath cloud in the bitter Vosges air, while German voices drifted up from the tree line below. The weapon that had held them for an hour lay useless beside him. Its barrel cracked from overheating, ammunition belt twisted like metal ribbon across the threshold where Lieutenant Morrison had fallen 3 hours before. Murphy's hands moved automatically, checking his rifle, counting rounds, calculating distances the way his father had taught him to gauge fence posts across Texas pasture. But this wasn't hunting rabbits in Hunt County. This was January 1945, in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, where the 3rd Infantry Division had been grinding through snow-choked forests for weeks, pushing German forces back toward the Rhine, one frozen foxhole at a time. The morning had started with 3rd Battalion's promise of easy ground, a sweep through vineyard country where scattered resistance would melt away before coordinated American firepower. Murphy's company had drawn the left flank, advancing through mist that clung to the rolling hills like smoke from a chimney fire. The plan called for radio contact, artillery support, and orderly movement toward objectives marked in red on Lieutenant Morrison's map. None of those things had survived the first burst of machine gun fire from the ridgeline above. The Germans had been waiting, not retreating. A full company of Fallschirmjäger dug into positions that commanded the entire valley, letting the Americans walk into a kill zone where every fold of ground was pre-registered for mortars and every approach covered by interlocking fire. Morrison had taken shrapnel in the opening minutes, leaving Murphy with 8 men, dwindling ammunition, and a radio that crackled with static instead of orders. That was when he'd spotted the abandoned German position beside the farmhouse. The MG15, with its crew pulled back in haste, 3 full ammunition boxes stacked beside the bipod legs. Any sensible soldier would have destroyed it, or left it alone. American forces trained on American weapons, not captured German hardware that could jam at the worst possible moment. But Murphy had grown up in Texas brush country where you used whatever worked, and the long barrel promised reach his squad's rifles couldn't match. He'd spent 20 minutes figuring out the mechanism while Corporal Hayes and Private Rodriguez held the perimeter, learning the rhythm of German engineering built to last through exactly this kind of morning. The weapon had worked for 40 minutes, laying down suppressing fire that kept the enemy cautious, buying time for his men to set up defensive positions in the farmhouse. Then the bolt seized on a deformed round, leaving Murphy with his rifle and whatever remained of his squad's ammunition against a full company of German infantry. Hayes appeared at his elbow, face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. "Audie, we can't hold this much longer. Battalion's got to know we're cut off up here." Murphy studied the slope below, counting movement in the tree line, estimating the next assault. The Vosges Mountains stretched away in all directions, snow-covered ridges hiding God knew how many enemy positions. Somewhere in those forests, the rest of 3rd Battalion was fighting its own battles, but Murphy's 8 men were alone with the crossroads and whatever lay beyond it. "Ridge is still quiet," he said, nodding toward the heights where 2nd Platoon should have been providing overwatch. "No friendly fire coming down, because there's nobody left up there to shoot." The truth hung between them like the morning mist. Murphy checked his rifle again, feeling the weight of steel and wood that would have to serve where the machine gun couldn't. In the distance, German voices called to each other with growing confidence. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The second German probe came from 2 directions, testing Murphy's flanks while the main force gathered in the tree line 300 yards downslope. From his position behind the farmhouse wall, Murphy could see the tactical problem unfolding like a geometry lesson written in movement and terrain. The Vosges Mountains offered excellent defensive positions for whoever got there first, but his squad had arrived as attackers and found themselves defending ground they'd never meant to hold. Rodriguez appeared at the south window, cradling a German submachine gun he'd stripped from the abandoned position. "Ammo situation's getting tight, Sarge. Maybe 20 rounds per man, plus whatever's left in these kraut boxes." Murphy nodded, calculating. 20 rounds didn't buy much time against a company-sized assault, but it might be enough if he could force the Germans to approach across open ground where every shot counted. The problem was the tree line. Too much cover, too many angles of approach, too many ways for disciplined infantry to close the distance without exposing themselves to rifle fire. "Hayes, what's the word from battalion?" The corporal looked up from the radio, shaking his head. "Still nothing but static. Could be atmospheric, could be the mountains, could be nobody left to talk to." The isolation settled over Murphy like the January cold, seeping through his field jacket. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the 3rd Infantry Division was continuing its advance toward the Rhine, but his 8 men occupied their own small war where battalion frequencies and fire support coordinates meant nothing. The Vosges had swallowed them completely. Private Coleman, barely 18 and 3 months out of replacement depot, crouched beside the east wall with his rifle trained on the vineyard rows. "Sarge, you think they're gonna try to take us alive?" "Don't think about that," Murphy said. "Think about making every round count." But the question hung in the air with the smell of cordite and the distant sound of engines. German armor was moving somewhere in the valley below, tanks or assault guns repositioning for the final push. Murphy had seen what happened when isolated American positions got overrun in the Vosges. Sometimes there were survivors to interrogate, sometimes there weren't. The 3rd assault began with mortar rounds, walking across the farmhouse courtyard, close enough to shake loose mortar from the stone walls. Murphy moved from window to window, calling out targets, conserving ammunition, trying to maintain the illusion of a force larger than 8 riflemen with a handful of German weapons. The enemy was being methodical now, probing each approach, testing his responses, looking for the weak point that would let them close the distance. Through the south window, Murphy caught sight of German infantry moving through the vineyard in short rushes. Good soldiers, well-trained, using terrain and covering fire the way his own manual prescribed. They'd identified his position, estimated his strength, and calculated the cost of taking the farmhouse. Now they were implementing the solution with mechanical efficiency. A bullet sprang off the window frame beside his head, close enough to spray stone chips across his cheek. Murphy dropped below the sill, working the bolt of his rifle, listening to Hayes coordinate fields of fire from the other side of the room. This was how it ended for small units in the Vosges, surrounded, outgunned, buying time with blood, until the mathematics of ammunition and infantry caught up with courage. But Murphy found himself thinking about the MG15 lying broken beside the farmhouse wall. German engineering built to last, seized at the worst possible moment on a single deformed cartridge. Sometimes the best equipment failed when you needed it most. Sometimes you had to make do with whatever remained. Rodriguez fired a burst from his captured submachine gun, then called out, "They're massing for another push, Sarge. Maybe squad strength coming up the east slope." Murphy checked his rifle, counted his remaining rounds, and calculated the distance between his position and the pile of German stick grenades beside the broken machine gun. Sometimes the impossible required nothing more than the willingness to try. The sound of German armor grew louder in the valley below, the distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles negotiating winter roads through the Vosges terrain. Murphy pressed himself against the farmhouse wall, listening to engines downshift as they climbed grades, estimating distances and directions, while his squad prepared for what might be their final stand. The 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting in these mountains for weeks, but Murphy had never felt as isolated as he did now, cut off from battalion frequency and watching enemy infantry gather for an assault his 8 men couldn't possibly repel. Hayes crawled across the floor, keeping below the window line as sniper rounds probed the farmhouse openings. Radios completely dead now. Either the set's damaged or they're jamming us. Murphy nodded, accepting another piece of bad news with the calm that came from having too many problems to process individually. The tactical situation was simple enough. Hold the crossroads until relieved or hold it until overrun. Everything else was detail work. Private Rodriguez had taken a defensive position covering the east approach. His captured German submachine gun trained on the vineyard rows, where enemy movement flickered between the winter bare vines. "Sarge, I count at least 2 squads forming up down there. They're going to hit us from 3 directions this time." Through the south window, Murphy could see German soldiers moving with the confidence of men who knew the outcome. They'd identified his strength, calculated his ammunition expenditure, and decided the farmhouse was ready for harvesting. In the Vosges, isolated American positions fell with predictable regularity once the enemy committed sufficient force. Murphy's 8 rifles wouldn't change those mathematics. Coleman appeared from the north wall, his young face tight with the kind of fear that made men either freeze or fight harder than they'd thought possible. "Movement on the ridge too, Sarge. Looks like they're bringing up a machine gun." The net was closing with professional efficiency. Murphy found himself thinking about Lieutenant Morrison's briefing that morning, how 3rd Battalion would sweep through scattered resistance, mopping up German stragglers retreating toward the Rhine. The reality felt different. Disciplined enemy forces using terrain and weather to their advantage, turning American confidence into American casualties, one isolated unit at a time. But Murphy's mind kept returning to the broken MG15 beside the farmhouse threshold. 40 minutes of suppressing fire from a weapon he'd never been trained to operate, holding ground that should have been overrun in the first assault. German engineering seized at the crucial moment by a single deformed cartridge that jammed the bolt beyond field repair. Hayes fired twice from the west window, then dropped back to reload. "They're getting bold out there. Next push is going to be the real thing." Murphy checked his rifle, counting rounds that wouldn't last through a determined assault by company-strength infantry. Somewhere in the Vosges, other Americans were advancing according to plan, supported by artillery and armor, coordinating movement through functioning radio networks. His war had shrunk to 8 men, a stone farmhouse, and whatever remained in their ammunition pouches. "Rodriguez, how many grenades in that German pile?" "Maybe a dozen potato mashers, plus some of those egg-shaped ones." Murphy calculated distances, blast radii, and the time it would take to cross open ground under fire. The Germans would expect him to defend from the farmhouse, using walls and windows for protection. They wouldn't expect him to advance toward their assault, carrying captured grenades across terrain that offered no cover except speed and surprise. The rumble of armor grew closer, echoing off the ridgelines that contained the valley like amphitheater walls. Murphy had seen what happened when German tanks supported infantry attacks in the Vosges. Even the best defensive positions became temporary when the enemy brought enough firepower to bear. Hayes looked up from checking his ammunition. "Orders, Sarge?" Murphy was already moving toward the threshold where the MG15 lay among scattered brass and empty ammunition boxes. Sometimes the impossible required nothing more than accepting that conventional defensive tactics wouldn't work. Sometimes you had to carry the fight forward when every instinct said to dig deeper and hold on. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The German assault began with mortar rounds walking across the farmhouse courtyard, each explosion closer than the last, shaking loose mortar from stone walls that had sheltered French farmers for generations before becoming an American strongpoint in the Vosges. Murphy crouched beside the threshold, gathering German stick grenades from the pile beside the broken MG15, feeling their weight in his hands while enemy infantry moved through the tree line 300 yards below. Hayes fired from the west window, his rifle cracked sharp against the heavier sound of German machine guns opening up from multiple positions. They're coming from all sides this time, Audie, maybe 40 men with fire support. Murphy slung his rifle and stuffed grenades into every available pocket, calculating the distance between the farmhouse and the German assembly areas. The mathematics were simple. 8 American rifles against company-strength infantry meant the defensive position would be overrun within minutes. But the enemy was massing in the open, confident in their numerical advantage, expecting Murphy's squad to fight from behind stone walls until ammunition ran out. Rodriguez called from the south window, "Armor moving up the road. Looks like an assault gun." The rumble of tracked vehicles echoed off the ridgelines, confirming what Murphy already knew. The Germans had decided to finish the farmhouse with overwhelming force, rather than accept casualties from a prolonged siege. In the Vosges, isolated American positions fell when the enemy brought enough firepower to bear, and Murphy's 8 men represented a tactical problem to be solved with steel and explosives. But as Murphy moved toward the farmhouse door, his mind fixed on a different calculation. The German infantry was gathering in predictable positions, dead ground below the ridgeline, covered approaches through the vineyard, assembly areas that offered protection from rifle fire. They were following doctrine, using terrain advantages, coordinating their assault like the professional soldiers they were. They weren't expecting an American sergeant to charge into their midst, carrying captured grenades. "Hayes, give me covering fire for 30 seconds. Then pull back to the north wall and hold as long as you can." Hayes stared at him, understanding flooding across his dirt-streaked face. "Audie, that's suicide. You won't make it 50 yards. Murphy checked the grenades, ensuring the pull-cord fuses were clear, remembering the timing he'd observed from German weapons used against his own positions. 5 seconds from activation to detonation, enough time to throw if you didn't hesitate, enough time to die if you calculated wrong. "Covering fire," he repeated, stepping through the doorway into January air that tasted of cordite and snow. The first 50 yards crossed open ground between the farmhouse and the stone wall that bordered the vineyard. Murphy moved in short rushes, using what cover existed. A farm cart, a pile of cut firewood, a depression where winter runoff had carved the earth. German rifles opened up immediately, bullets snapping past his head. But the enemy fire was hasty, unaimed, confused by the sudden reversal of tactical expectations. A machine gun from the ridgeline began tracking him, tracers burning bright lines through the morning air. Murphy dove behind the stone wall as bullets chipped fragments from the barrier, feeling the impact vibrations through his chest while he calculated the next bound toward German positions that had suddenly become vulnerable instead of threatening. From this distance, he could see individual enemy soldiers, young faces under steel helmets, hands working rifle bolts, officers pointing and shouting orders that tried to adjust tactics for an assault that had turned backward. The Vosges had taught Murphy that warfare came down to small decisions made by individual men, and his decision was to carry captured German grenades into positions where German infantry expected to advance safely. The broken MG15 lay visible behind him, its cracked barrel reflecting morning light like a monument to weapons that failed when needed most. But the grenades in Murphy's pockets were German engineering too, designed to fragment steel and flesh with mechanical efficiency when activated by desperate men making impossible choices in frozen farmhouse courtyards. Murphy pulled the cord on his first grenade, counted 3 seconds, and threw it toward the assembly area where German infantry was reorganizing for an assault that would never come. The first grenade exploded among the German assembly area with a sharp crack that scattered infantry who had been massing for the final assault on the farmhouse. Murphy didn't wait to assess damage. He was already moving along the stone wall, using its cover to approach the next concentration of enemy soldiers who were still adjusting to the reversal of their tactical situation. In the Vosges Mountains, warfare often came down to seconds of confusion when training met the unexpected, and Murphy had learned to live in those seconds where conventional doctrine stopped working. From the farmhouse behind him, Hayes and Rodriguez maintained covering fire that forced German heads down at crucial moments, buying Murphy the time he needed to close distance that should have been impossible to cross. The sound of rifle fire mixed with shouts in German as enemy soldiers tried to understand why an isolated American position was attacking instead of defending, why one man was advancing toward company-strength infantry with nothing but captured grenades and the kind of determination that didn't translate into any tactical manual. Murphy reached the vineyard's edge and threw his second grenade toward a machine gun position that had been raking the farmhouse. The explosion silenced the weapon temporarily, but more dangerous was the psychological effect. German infantry pulling back from positions they'd held confidently, officers trying to reorganize an assault that had become a defense against an attack they hadn't expected. A rifle bullet tugged at Murphy's field jacket, close enough to burn, but he was already moving toward the next target. The German assault gun was grinding up the road, its cannon traversing toward the farmhouse where his squad was holding their impossible position. Murphy pulled 2 grenades, calculating angles and timing, while German small arms fire searched for him among the vineyard rows. The secret the after-action report would never capture was the terror. Not the clean fear of tactical situations where doctrine provided answers, but the gut-deep panic of carrying explosives across open ground while machine gun tracers burned past his head and mortar rounds walked closer to his position with each adjustment. Murphy's hands shook as he pulled grenade pins. His breath came in gasps that had nothing to do with the January cold, and his mind screamed at him to drop the grenades and run toward any cover that offered protection instead of exposure. But Rodriguez was still fighting from the farmhouse south window. Hayes was working his rifle from the west wall. Coleman and the others were holding positions they couldn't abandon because Murphy was buying them time with captured German engineering turned against its makers. The mathematics of responsibility outweighed the mathematics of survival, and Murphy kept moving toward targets that grew more dangerous as he closed the distance. The assault gun's cannon swung toward him, its barrel massive and black against the Vosges skyline. Murphy threw both grenades toward the vehicle's tracks, diving behind a stone retaining wall as the cannon fired over his head with a sound like the world tearing apart. The grenades exploded almost simultaneously, close enough to damage road wheels and force the crew to halt while they assessed the situation. German infantry was falling back now, confused by an attack that violated every principle of tactical common sense. But Murphy knew the advantage was temporary. Professional soldiers would reorganize, officers would establish new firing positions, and the assault would resume with adjusted tactics that accounted for his individual threat. In the Vosges, tactical advantages lasted only as long as the enemy needed to adapt. Murphy gathered his remaining grenades, counted 4 left, and calculated the distance back to the farmhouse where his squad was waiting. The return trip would be harder. German soldiers knew his position now. Machine guns were repositioning to cover his likely routes, and the element of surprise had been expended like ammunition. But the MG15 still lay broken beside the farmhouse threshold, testament to weapons that worked until they didn't. Engineering that lasted until single, deformed cartridges jammed mechanisms at the worst possible moments. Murphy had learned to continue when reliable things failed, to advance when doctrine called for defense, to carry captured grenades toward enemy positions, because sometimes the impossible was simply what remained when everything sensible had been exhausted. Murphy reached the farmhouse threshold as German mortar rounds began falling with renewed accuracy, the enemy having reorganized enough to coordinate indirect fire with their scattered infantry positions. The broken MG15 lay where he'd left it, barrel cracked and action seized, surrounded by empty ammunition boxes and brass cases that caught the winter light like scattered coins. Hayes appeared at his shoulder, face streaked with cordite and relief. "Thought you weren't coming back," Hayes said, working his rifle bolt to chamber another round. Murphy dropped beside the stone wall, feeling exhaustion settle into his bones along with the cold that had been waiting for adrenaline to fade. His remaining grenades felt heavier now, their weight more significant, because the German response would be different this time, more cautious, better coordinated, supported by the assault gun that was repositioning despite damaged tracks. Rodriguez called from the south window, "Movement in the tree line again. They're not giving up." But something had changed in the rhythm of enemy fire. The machine guns from the ridgeline were shooting longer bursts at more distant targets, and the mortar rounds were falling in a pattern that suggested divided attention. Murphy listened to the sound signature of the Vosges battle, learning to read the difference between focused assault and scattered defense. Then Hayes heard it first, the sound of American armor grinding up the valley road from the east, Sherman tank engines and the higher whine of M10 tank destroyers moving in column formation. Battalion had broken through whatever German positions had been blocking their advance, and 3rd Battalion's delayed support was finally arriving to relieve Murphy's isolated squad. "Radio contact!" Coleman shouted from the east wall, where he'd been monitoring the damage set. "Battalion frequency coming through clear." Murphy took the handset, feeling its weight like a connection to the larger war beyond their farmhouse strongpoint. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, asking for situation reports and ammunition status, coordinates and casualty figures that would become lines in an after-action summary. 8 men holding crossroads position, Murphy reported. "Enemy company strength with armor support. We can hold until you reach us." But even as he spoke, Murphy knew the official version would miss essential details. The report wouldn't capture Hayes working his rifle from multiple windows, moving constantly to maintain the illusion of larger forces. It wouldn't mention Rodriguez making every round count with captured German weapons, or Coleman holding his position despite being 18 and terrified. The paperwork would record successful defense of a crossroads, ammunition expended, enemy casualties estimated. It wouldn't mention Murphy's hands shaking as he pulled grenade pins, or the way terror and determination had combined into something that allowed impossible advances across open ground. The after-action report would note innovative use of captured equipment and aggressive defensive tactics, but it would miss the private moments when training failed, and individual men had to decide whether to continue or break. 20 minutes later, lead elements of 3rd Battalion reached the farmhouse perimeter, M4 Shermans, providing overwatch, while infantry secured the crossroads Murphy's squad had held through the morning. The German assault dissolved as enemy forces pulled back toward prepared positions deeper in the Vosges, leaving behind equipment and casualties that testified to the morning's confused fighting. Murphy sat beside the broken MG15, watching medics treat Rodriguez's superficial wounds, while Hayes guided the relief column's sergeant through their defensive positions. The weapon that had held the enemy for 40 minutes would be listed in the report as captured equipment, destroyed by overheating. The grenades that had broken the German assault would become a footnote about ammunition expended. Years later, when the citations had been written and the medals awarded, Murphy would remember the weight of German steel in his hands more than the weight of ribbons on his chest. He would remember the sound of rifle bolts working in the farmhouse, the way winter light reflected off empty brass cases, the moment when reliable weapons failed and men continued anyway. The Vosges Mountains stretched away toward the Rhine, snow-covered ridges hiding 1,000 similar actions where small units had held impossible positions because retreat wasn't an option and relief was uncertain. Murphy understood now that legends were lighter than memories, easier to carry, more comfortable for everyone except the men who had to live with what actually happened when the shooting stopped and the paperwork began. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, Tell us which country you watch from and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.